Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Russia, and specifically to talk about the spiralling cost of the war in Ukraine. The mayor of Moscow recently came out and announced that they are now paying 1.9 million rubles as a signing on bonus to anybody that's prepared to sign up to fight in the war in Ukraine for at least 12 months. And 1.9 million rubles, which obviously sounds like a huge amount of money, equates to around $22,000. So that's almost 2 years of the average salary in Russia. And this is a huge amount for soldiers who potentially have absolutely no experience whatsoever. So in today's video, I want to go through the details of that announcement, and we'll talk about why Russia has been forced to resort to these sort of levels, because it's been losing a lot of people over the past few months, and there are rising concerns in Russia about not having enough people to keep their war effort going. We'll have a look at how that sign-on bonus and the associated first-year package that soldiers will earn fighting in Ukraine compares to what you're paid as a first-year entrant in the US Army and the UK Army. We'll then have a look at the total losses that Russia have incurred so far in terms of all of the people who've been killed and injured, and what the economic impact of that has been for the Russian economy. We'll talk about the ongoing employment problems that Russia is experiencing right now as a result of the fact that it's lost people both in the war in Ukraine and also people who simply didn't want to run the risk of being called up, so they've fled the country. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of the costs of the war are for the Russian economy and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Ground News, who I've been working with since October 2022, so they're a long-time supporter of the channel. And what's great about Ground News is that they're not a news publisher, they're a news aggregator. They bring stories together from all around the world, which is fantastic from my perspective when I'm doing research, a deep dive into a topic, because I can look at lots of different articles all in one place. And if we look at the articles relating to today's story, you can see that Ground News found 13 different articles. 13% of these leant to the right, 50% were in the centre, and 38% were leaning to the left. And if we scroll down and have a look at one of the articles, you can see who owns that publication, the level of factuality, and whether or not it leans to the left, the right, or comes from the centre. And the great news is that Ground News is currently offering a special deal to Joe Blogs viewers, and I use the Vantage subscription, so check that out. And you can access this by clicking on the link in the description below, which is ground.news/Joe, or using the QR code on the screen now. On Tuesday the 23rd of August, the mayor of Moscow announced that anybody that was prepared to sign up for a minimum period of 12 months to fight in the war in Ukraine will be paid a signing on bonus of 1.9 million rubles, which equates to around $22,000. And as I said right at the beginning of this video, that equates to almost 2 years of the average salary in Ukraine. So that is a really big number for people who potentially have absolutely no experience of being in the army or firing a weapon. And this really tells us that Russia is desperate right now for more people to go and fight in Ukraine. In addition to the signing on fee, new recruits will also be paid a salary of 3.3 million rubles, meaning that they will earn a total of 5.2 million rubles, which is around $60,000 in their first year of service. In addition to their earnings, soldiers will also be offered compensation of between $5,600 and $11,400 for injuries depending on their severity, and the families of soldiers killed in action will be paid just over $34,000. And the reason why Russia is offering such lucrative packages to new recruits is that it's estimated that they've lost around 90% of all of their ground troops since the war in Ukraine started. It was recently reported that a declassified US intelligence assessment provided to Congress estimated that Russia has lost a staggering 87% of the total number of active duty ground troops it had prior to launching its invasion of Ukraine, along with 2/3 of its pre-invasion tanks. Out of 360,000 troops that made up Russia's pre-invasion ground force, including contract and conscript personnel, Russia has lost 315,000 on the battlefield, as well as 2,200 of 3,500 tanks and 4,400 of 13,600 infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers. And UK Defence Intelligence has estimated that the average daily Russian casualties, either killed or wounded in Ukraine, in May and June 2024 increased to conflict highs of 1,262 in May and 1,163 in June, and in total it's estimated that Russia lost over 70,000 personnel in May and June alone. The uptick in losses reflects Russia's opening of the new front in the Kharkiv region, while maintaining the same rate of offensive operations along the remainder of the front. Although this new approach has increased the pressure on the front line, an effective Ukrainian defence and lack of Russian training reduces Russia's ability to exploit any tactical successes despite attempting to stretch the front line further. UK Defence Intelligence estimates that Russia's casualty rate will likely continue to average above 1,000 men per day over the next 2 months as Russia continues to try to overmatch Ukrainian positions with mass. So what this data tells us is that Russia is now making a big effort to try to push Ukrainian forces back, but that effort is coming at a heavy cost. Over 1,000 people per day are being lost in battle. And that's why Russia is now having to recruit heavily to keep fielding more and more people to the front line. And it's now having to offer huge amounts of cash in order to incentivize people to go and join that fight. So let's have a look at how these figures compare to entry-level pay in the USA and the UK. This chart shows the active duty pay scales for the US Army, and on the left-hand side here we've got the different ranks, and the very first rank we see here, Private E1, is the entry level, and if we look along this chart, anybody that's been serving in the Army for less than 2 years will be paid a salary of $24,206. However, as you can see, there's an asterisk here, and that asterisk tells us that pay for Private E1s will be slightly lower for the first 4 months of service. So what those figures show us is that the pay that's being offered to new entrants in the Russian army of just under $60,000 is 2.5 times higher than it is in the USA, around $35,000 more. And obviously that's a huge premium, but if you take a step back and think about the risks, if you're joining as an entry level in the US Army, it's unlikely that you're going to be sent to an active combat zone at any point in the near future. However, if you're signing up for the Russian Army today, you're likely to find yourself in the front line within the next couple of weeks, and potentially you won't have had any training whatsoever. And this graphic shows the entry level salary for the UK Army. And as you can see, it's £18,687, which at the current exchange rate equates to $24,290, which interestingly is almost exactly the same to the cent to what the US Army is paying. So what this tells us is that Russia is having to pay 2.5 times the going average global rate for entry-level soldiers to try to encourage people to sign up and join the fight in Ukraine. So let's have a look at how those figures compare to the average salary in Russia. This chart shows average monthly wages in Russia over the past 5 years. And as you can see, they've been increasing consistently over the past 5 years. 5 years ago, the average monthly salary was around 48,000 rubles. However, the most recent figures that have been published by Russia show that that's increased to 84,000 rubles. And just to put that into context, at the current exchange rate, that equates to around $930 per month, which on an annualised basis is around $11,200. So the deal that's currently being offered by the Mayor of Moscow, whereby you can earn $59,600 in your first year, is almost 5.5 times higher than the average salary in Russia. And as I said right at the start of this video, the signing on fee itself of $22,000 equates to almost 2 years average earnings. And even if you strip out the signing on bonus, the salary of $37,600 is more than 3 times the average wage. So this is a very attractive package. But obviously one of the things you need to take into account is that not everybody that goes to the Ukraine war comes back alive. And so is it worth earning more than the average wage if you're potentially only going to be there for a very short period of time? I would say probably not. So let's have a look at the current level of casualties and the estimated cost of the war in Ukraine in personnel terms to Russia and the Russian economy. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that Russia is not publishing any official data in terms of the number of people injured and killed in Ukraine. However, there are lots of estimates. The USA estimated that 315,000 Russians had been killed or wounded in the battle up until the end of 2023. However, those estimates have been far exceeded by France, who estimate that 150,000 Russians have been killed. And the UK recently stated that it estimates that 465,000 Russians have either been killed or wounded so far. And that's obviously an absolutely huge number. What I wanted to do now is go through the economic implications of that from Russia's perspective. If we start off by looking at the compensation figures that Russia is currently offering to families for injured or dead personnel, they've stated that they'll pay just over $34,000 for any people that are killed in battle and up to $11,400 for any injuries sustained in Ukraine. So if we apply those figures to the data we've just looked at, the estimate of 150,000 dead personnel would equate to around $5 billion, and the compensation payments for the 315,000 people that were injured in battle would equate to a further $3.5 billion. So that's a total of $8.5 billion that Russia is having to pay to those people and their families. However, the situation has got significantly worse recently. As we reported, in May and June, Russia is estimated to be losing around 1,100 people per day in the battle. And on an annualized basis, that would equate to a cost of around $5 billion. So Russia is really ramping up things at the moment in the front line, and that's equating to more and more cost in terms of all those compensation payments. But the problem from Russia's economy perspective is much worse than that, because you don't have to just pay out for those individuals who aren't coming back. You also lose the value that they were going to contribute to the Russian economy, because the more people that die or get injured in battle and therefore can't come back and work means that they can't contribute to the state. They're not earning any money, therefore they're not contributing in terms of paying taxes, national insurance, social security, all of those sort of things. And so they then become a burden for the state. It's estimated that the average age of soldiers being killed in Ukraine is 34. And when you compare that to the current retirement age in Russia of 63 for men, that means that those people who are no longer able to work are missing out on 29 years of contributions to the state. If we then apply the average salary of $11,200 to those 29 years, that means that in total, those individuals are not contributing around $325,000 over the lifetime of work that they've lost out on. And if you apply that figure to the estimated 465,000 people who've been injured or killed in Ukraine so far, that equates to lost contribution of around $145 billion. So this isn't the actual cost today. This is the long-term implication on the Russian economy. And this is something that we've discussed before. The problem that Russia is building for itself is that the more people that it loses in Ukraine means that it's got less workforce that can produce things and produce value for the Russian economy. And therefore, it will apply further pressure on Russia because its economy will start to shrink over the longer term. So let's have a look at what's going on with regards to employment. This chart shows the number of people employed in Russia over the past 12 months, and the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in millions of people and goes from 73.2 million at the bottom to 74.5 million at the top. And what this shows is that the number of employed people hit a peak of 74.2 million in August and December 2023. However, in 2024, those figures have been falling. They fell to 73.8 million in January, 73.6 million in February, 73.4 million in March, and then bounced back to 73.7 million in April. However, Russia has not published any figures for May or June, which interestingly is the period that UK intelligence says that Russia was losing more than 1,100 men per day in the front line in Ukraine. And if we look at this chart, it shows the total number of unemployed people in Russia, and the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is also shown in millions of people and goes from 1.8 million people at the bottom to 5 million at the top. And what this chart shows is that since the beginning of 2022, the total number of unemployed people in Russia has reduced from 3.3 million to the current level of 2 million. And whilst you might be sitting there thinking, well, surely that's a good thing that the number of unemployed people has reduced by 1.3 million. That means that more people are joining the workforce and therefore becoming more productive. What it tells us is that Russia is now struggling in terms of actually finding enough employees to fill all of their jobs. And if we look at the unemployment rate over the same period, it's reduced from 4.4% in January 2022 to the current level of 2.6%. And if we compare those figures to what's happened in the USA, back in January 2022, the unemployment rate was 4%, and today it's sitting at 4.1%. And the US economy is currently seen to be very healthy and thriving. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the recent announcement by the mayor of Moscow that Russia is paying signing-on bonuses of $22,000 to anybody that's prepared to sign up and go and fight in Ukraine is absolutely fascinating. Signing on bonuses isn't something that you normally attribute to the armed forces. That's something that I would think about if I was thinking about sports stars. If somebody wanted to sign a footballer or a basketball player or somebody like that, then maybe they get a large signing on bonus before they've actually done anything at all. But clearly Russia now thinks that it needs to offer those sort of deals to try and encourage anybody to sign up and go and fight in Ukraine. And this tells us a couple of things. Firstly, it tells us that Russia is struggling to be able to get enough people to the front line, and the data that we've seen, whereby it's been reported in May that Russia has lost over 1,100 people per day. That's not per month, that's per day. That is a lot of casualties. You need to keep your recruitment going at a rapid rate to keep replenishing all of those people. That's obviously an issue from Russia's point of view. But also, I think it tells us that people are not keen to sign up, because if you're having to offer a large cash bonus up front, that tells me that nobody's really interested in those sorts of jobs. They only do that if they're desperate to actually get people to sign up. And obviously, from a risk perspective, if you think about it from your own point of view, it doesn't really matter to me how much Russia was prepared to offer me to go and sign and fight in Ukraine. I simply wouldn't do it because the risk profile of going there is just too high. It's highly likely that you're either going to be killed or injured in battle very, very quickly, particularly if you're not from the armed forces. If you don't have a history of being trained to go into battle, then clearly you're not really ready to go and stand in a trench somewhere in Ukraine and start firing guns at people and trying to avoid being killed. The risk-reward equation just simply doesn't stack up from where I'm sitting. And the data that we looked at in today's video, looking at the total casualties that Russia has incurred so far, is absolutely mind-bending. It's estimated that 465,000 men have been killed or wounded so far in the war. And when you think about the cost of that, it's absolutely astronomical. And we talked about it earlier in the video. The compensation costs from Russia's point of view are probably sitting at around $10 billion. That's just payments that Russia is having to make to the families of all of those people involved to compensate them for the injuries or the death. But the much bigger issue from Russia's point of view is the damage it's causing to their economy, because as we've talked about in many other videos, when you've got a population that's in decline, such as Russia has at the moment, it's got a low birth rate and a high death rate. And we've seen the population actually reducing in size. That puts pressure in terms of increasing your GDP. If you've got a smaller number of people, all of those people need to become more productive relatively to keep GDP growing. But when you've got an acceleration in your population decline that's being caused firstly by the losses in Ukraine. So the people who are going over there are coming back either in a box or they're not able to work, a lot of them. So that's causing Russia a problem. But also, they've had the exodus of people. As soon as the war was announced, it was estimated that around 500,000 people fled the country because they didn't want to stay around in case they got called up. And then later in 2022, when President Putin announced that he was mobilizing a further 300,000 people, there was a possibility that you could get conscripted. You would be forced to sign up and go and fight in Ukraine. And it was estimated that around 700,000 people left the country at that point. So that's 1.2 million people who decided to emigrate away from Russia as a direct announcement of the war. And then you've got a further 500,000 people who've been injured or killed. So in total, we're talking over 1.5 million people that have been taken out of the Russian workforce. And as we saw earlier in the video, the total workforce is only sitting at around 72 million. So that's a meaningful percentage. And in terms of that exodus, a lot of the people that left were the higher skilled, more educated, senior people, the management that you need to be right at the top of their game, helping those companies to grow and develop, particularly at a time like the last couple of years when Russia has faced a lot of challenges and a lot of headwinds. It's had all of the sanctions applied against it. So you need your best people to be thinking on their feet to try to get their businesses to develop and work with what's going on. But the other issue that we discussed in today's video is that it's not just the compensation and the loss of people that's a problem from Russia's point of view. There's also that lost GDP for all of those people who've been injured or killed in Ukraine. And it's estimated that that figure could be as much as $200 billion over the lifetime of all of those individuals. So that's basically the lost earnings that they would have been contributing during the rest of their working lives if they'd have come back from Ukraine and carried on with the jobs that they were doing. So the impact of all of these personnel issues is absolutely huge from Russia's point of view. And this obviously doesn't include the cost of all of the equipment and everything else that Russia has been losing on a daily basis. And one of the other major factors that we've talked about in other videos is the fact that today, in order to keep the wartime effort going and make sure that the army have enough equipment, a lot of companies in Russia have now been commandeered. They've been told to produce things to keep the war going. And so those companies are now being paid directly by the Kremlin. That's good from their point of view, but they're no longer dealing with their customers globally. And if the war in Ukraine was to stop tomorrow, that would mean that those companies would be potentially left high and dry because they would no longer get paid by the Kremlin. And so they'd have to go back to doing what they were doing historically. However, their customers are likely to have moved on. They will be sourcing their products from elsewhere around the globe. And that could have a massive long-term negative impact on the Russian economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that the losses in Ukraine so far have been highly damaging from Russia's point of view. They've had to pay out a huge amount of compensation for all of the people that have been killed and injured. They've also had to recruit in more people at a huge cost to keep feeding the front line in Ukraine. In addition to that, the long-term loss of earnings for the people who've either been killed, injured or emigrated from Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine is going to have a huge long-term negative impact on Russia's GDP and its economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Don't forget, if you'd like to win this, then check out the details in the link below. And here's something to put a smile on your face. I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give away another one of my sculptures, and it's this piece, which is called Windswept Clock, because it's actually got a fully functioning clock built into it, and it's by a British artist called Paul Margetts, who I've got a lot of different pieces from, and I think this is absolutely fantastic. It's really heavy. This would look amazing in anybody's place. And you can win this by entering into the prize draw, and the tickets are priced at only £1 each, which is around $1.30. So if you want to support the channel, rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket and you could win this thing, and you can follow on from the previous winners like Craig in Australia, who won the little red balloon dog, and Lars from the Netherlands, who won Stiltman. And there is a potential, if you do win, that you may have to pay some import duty. I don't think Craig or Lars did, so maybe you won't. And I'm getting an independent company to organise everything for me, so it's all above board. I won't be involved in drawing the winner. That's entirely at random. But if you'd like to win this, an original Joe Bloggs sculpture, you can't buy these things, you can only win them, then have a look at the details below and buy a ticket, and good luck.